The phone line crackled with static across 3,000 miles of Atlantic cable. It was 4:23 a.m., March 8, 1944, and in a fortified bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler held a receiver so tightly his knuckles had gone white. On the other end, SS Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff measured each word like a man defusing a bomb. Mein Führer, the conventional approaches have failed. The Negro fighter group remains intact. Their combat record is, he paused, the silence stretching like a taut wire, statistically impossible. We have lost 43 aircraft to them in 2 months. They have lost none. Hitler's jaw clenched. The report on his desk told the same story in cold numbers. 68 consecutive bomber escort missions without a single loss. The Americans had deployed a weapon that violated the fundamental laws of his ideology, and conventional warfare couldn't touch them. What he whispered next would set in motion the darkest covert operation of the European theater, one so explosive that Allied command would spend 8 decades burying every document, every witness, every trace of what really happened to the men they called the Red Tails. This is the true story of how excellence became a death sentence, how the Third Reich's obsession with racial theory drove them to abandon the rules of war entirely, and how the greatest threat to the Tuskegee Airmen wasn't German fighters at 20,000 feet. It was a coordinated assassination campaign that targeted them on the ground, in the air, and even in their sleep. For 80 years, the full scope of this operation remained classified, hidden behind layers of Cold War secrecy and institutional embarrassment. The documents exist now, declassified in 2023, scattered across archives in Washington, Moscow, and Berlin. They tell a story of systematic targeting, of murders disguised as accidents, of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of both Axis and Allied command. They tell the story of men who proved human ability transcends race while fighting 2 wars simultaneously, one against fascism in the skies, another against something far more insidious on the ground. January 27, 1944, Ramatelli Airfield, Italy. Captain Benjamin Davis, Jr., son of the Army's first black general and commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, stood in the pre-dawn cold outside the operations tent. His breath misted in the air as he studied the mission briefing for the day's escort run to Anzio. Behind him, the rumble of Allison engines warming up mixed with the nervous laughter of pilots preparing for combat. Everything appeared routine. The mechanics had cleared all 47 P-51 Mustangs for flight. Weather conditions were acceptable. Intelligence reported moderate Luftwaffe activity over the target zone. But Davis's attention kept returning to a small detail in the maintenance log that didn't quite fit. 3 aircraft had developed identical fuel line anomalies overnight. Not malfunctions, anomalies. The head mechanic, Staff Sergeant James Wiley, a 32-year-old from Detroit who'd served with Davis since Tuskegee, stood beside him with a troubled expression. "Sir, I've been turning wrenches for 12 years. Fuel systems don't fail in patterns. Not like this." Davis picked up the logbook, his finger tracing the entries. Each affected aircraft belonged to the squadron's most experienced pilots. Each anomaly had been discovered during routine pre-flight, caught just before what would have been catastrophic in-flight failure. The pattern wasn't mechanical. It was intentional. "Ground all 3 birds until we strip the fuel systems completely," Davis ordered, his voice carrying the weight of command, but not the explanation behind it. He couldn't voice his suspicion yet, not without evidence, not without risking panic that could shatter unit cohesion. But in the back of his mind, a cold certainty was forming. Someone had accessed their aircraft. Someone with technical knowledge and unrestricted base access. Someone who understood that killing Tuskegee pilots in obvious combat would create martyrs, but eliminating them through apparent mechanical failure would simply make them statistics. Wiley nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without words. "I'll need to inspect the fuel trucks too, sir. And check who had hangar access overnight." As the sergeant walked away, Davis turned to watch his pilots climbing into cockpits across the flight line. They were laughing, confident, unaware that the war had just changed in ways their training had never prepared them for. In 6 hours, one of those men would be dead, and the official cause would read, "Equipment malfunction." But the truth, buried in classified files for 80 years, would tell a different story entirely. The first confirmed kill came at 14:47 hours on January 27, 1944. First Lieutenant William Armstrong, a 24-year-old from Philadelphia with 16 confirmed aerial victories, was returning from a successful escort mission over Anzio. His P-51 Mustang, Red 7, broke formation at 8,000 feet over the Adriatic Sea. No radio call. No visible damage. No enemy contact in the area. He simply rolled, inverted, and dove straight into the water at terminal velocity. Witnesses reported the aircraft remained under power throughout the dive, suggesting Armstrong hadn't even attempted to bail out. The crash investigation took 48 hours. Captain Davis personally inspected what little wreckage could be recovered from the seafloor. The official report concluded hypoxia due to oxygen system failure as the probable cause. But the oxygen system, miraculously intact in the salvaged cockpit section, showed no mechanical defects. What it did show, hidden in a place no routine inspection would catch, was a microscopic puncture in the oxygen line leading to the pilot's mask. The puncture was too precise to be accidental, positioned exactly where it would allow carbon monoxide from the engine to mix with breathable air. Armstrong hadn't lost consciousness from lack of oxygen. He'd been poisoned by his own aircraft. Davis stood on the dock at Termoli Harbor, watching recovery crews winch the shattered fuselage section onto a barge, and felt the weight of command crystallize into something heavier. The burden of knowing. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. And if he reported it through official channels, if he started making accusations without ironclad proof, he risked being labeled paranoid, seeing racism where there was only mechanical failure. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very discrimination that made his unit a target also made it impossible to report being targeted. He turned to Lieutenant Colonel George Roberts, his executive officer, a 38-year-old career officer from Washington who'd fought his way through every barrier the Army could erect. Roberts had been studying the oxygen line under a magnifying glass, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir, I found metal shavings in the puncture. Someone drilled this, recently. The edges are clean." Davis nodded slowly. "How many people have unrestricted access to our aircraft?" Roberts's jaw tightened. "At Ramatelli? Approximately 240 personnel. That includes our own mechanics, Allied support staff, Italian civilian contractors, and rotating personnel from other units sharing the base." The mathematics of the situation were brutal. One saboteur among hundreds, any investigation would tip them off, and continuing operations meant exposing his pilots to an invisible threat they couldn't defend against. Davis made the only decision he could make. "We keep this between us. We implement new security protocols quietly. Random aircraft assignments, armed guards on the flight line 24/7. Pilots inspect their own oxygen systems before every mission. And we document everything." Roberts understood immediately. "You think this goes higher than one saboteur?" It wasn't a question. Davis looked back at the wreckage, thinking about the precision of the attack, the knowledge required, the access needed. "I think we're dealing with an organized operation. And I think Armstrong won't be the last." 3,000 miles away, in a concrete bunker 20 feet beneath Berlin, Adolf Hitler studied reconnaissance photographs spread across a mahogany table that had once belonged to Bismarck. The images showed Ramatelli Airfield in precise detail: aircraft dispersal patterns, defensive positions, fuel storage facilities. But Hitler's attention was fixed on a different kind of intelligence report, this one delivered personally by Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. The report was 47 pages long, typed on thin paper, marked with the highest classification the Third Reich possessed. Its title, translated from German, Operational Assessment and Tactical Recommendations Regarding the American Negro Fighter Group. Himmler stood at attention as Hitler read, his pale fingers turning pages with increasing agitation. The report was devastating in its honesty. It catalogued every encounter between the 332nd Fighter Group and Luftwaffe forces since their deployment. It analyzed their tactics, their discipline, their combat effectiveness. And it reached a conclusion that struck at the heart of everything the Third Reich claimed to represent. The Negro pilots weren't just competent. They were among the most effective fighter units in the European theater, superior, in some metrics, to their white counterparts. Hitler reached the final page and set it down with deliberate care. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, which his generals knew to fear more than his famous rages. This report suggests that our racial theory is incorrect. Himmler didn't flinch. The report suggests, mein Führer, that the Americans have stumbled upon an unexpected advantage. These Negro pilots, facing discrimination from their own military, fight with a level of motivation and unit cohesion that transcends normal combat effectiveness. They have, essentially, turned their oppression into a weapon. It was a careful answer, one that reframed ideological failure as enemy innovation. Hitler stood and walked to the map of Europe covering the Eastern Wall. His finger traced the bomber routes from Italy to the Reich's industrial heartland. Every successful mission they fly undermines us twice, once militarily, once ideologically. The Americans bomb our factories while their Negro pilots prove our philosophy false. If this continues, if this unit's success becomes widely known, if they survive the war as heroes, he turned back to Himmler, and his eyes held something close to desperation. Then everything we've built collapses under the weight of a single contradiction. Himmler had anticipated this moment. He reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew a second report, this one much thinner. Mein Führer, there are methods available to us that exist outside conventional military operations. Methods that leave no trace, create no martyrs, and eliminate the problem while maintaining plausible deniability. Hitler took the document. Its title was deliberately vague. Special Operations Proposal, Target Reduction Through Indirect Action. He read in silence for 3 minutes, while Himmler waited. The proposal was elegant in its brutality. It called for the formation of a special SS unit, tasked specifically with eliminating the 332nd Fighter Group through covert action. Not aerial combat, which had proven ineffective and only added to their legend. Not direct assassination, which would create martyrs and potentially expose Axis involvement. Instead, the proposal outlined a campaign of sabotage, poisoning, and manufactured accidents that would degrade the unit's effectiveness while appearing to be nothing more than the normal attrition of war. Equipment failures, training accidents, medical emergencies, friendly fire incidents, each death would be explainable, defensible, unremarkable. The cumulative effect would destroy the unit without anyone quite understanding why. Hitler read it twice. Then he looked up at Himmler and said 4 words that would set the conspiracy in motion. Make it look natural. What followed would become one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II. A black operation so sensitive that fewer than 20 people in the entire Third Reich knew of its existence. Its operational name, lost to history but recovered from declassified files in 2023, was Unternehmen Schattenreiter, Operation Shadow Rider. Its budget came from discretionary SS funds with no paper trail. Its personnel were recruited from Sicherheitsdienst operatives with experience in occupied territories, men who'd proven their ability to kill without fingerprints. Its commander was SS Sturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, the man who'd rescued Mussolini from Allied captivity, an expert in unconventional warfare, and someone Hitler trusted implicitly with impossible missions. Skorzeny received his orders on February 3, 1944, in a private meeting with Himmler that no official record acknowledges ever happened. The objectives were simple: reduce the operational effectiveness of the 332nd Fighter Group by at least 40% within 6 months, with zero attribution to German intelligence operations, and ensure no evidence survived that could implicate the Reich in targeted assassination of prisoners or non-combatants. The constraints were equally clear: avoid patterns that would alert Allied counterintelligence, prioritize high-value targets but maintain appearance of random casualties, and utilize local assets when possible to minimize German operative exposure. Skorzeny accepted the mission with the same professional detachment he brought to all his work. He was not an ideologue. He was a soldier who specialized in achieving objectives others considered impossible. If the Führer wanted Negro pilots dead quietly, Skorzeny would make them dead quietly. The how was simply a matter of technical problem-solving. He assembled his team within a week. 18 operatives drawn from Abwehr intelligence networks in Italy, supplemented by recruited agents from the Italian Social Republic who had access to Allied bases through supply contracts and construction work. None of them knew the full scope of Operation Shadow Rider. They operated in cells, each believing they were engaged in routine sabotage against American air operations, unaware they were part of a coordinated campaign targeting a specific unit for racial reasons. The first cell was activated on February 10, 1944. Their target, fuel supplies at Ramatelli Airfield. The operation was textbook. A contracted Italian fuel truck driver paid 3,000 lire and promised protection from Allied prosecution after the war. Added a carefully measured quantity of sugar solution to the underground fuel tanks that supplied the 332nd aircraft. Not enough to cause immediate engine failure, that would be too obvious. Just enough to create performance degradation over time, increasing the likelihood of combat losses or forcing aircraft to abort missions. The sabotage was discovered purely by accident. Staff Sergeant Wiley, still hypervigilant after Lieutenant Armstrong's death, had implemented unauthorized fuel testing protocols. On February 14th, one of his mechanics noticed crystallization in a fuel sample that shouldn't have been there. Wiley immediately grounded the entire squadron and began testing every fuel source on base. They found contamination in 3 of the main tanks, enough sugar solution to affect approximately 30 aircraft. If it had gone undetected for another week, the casualties would have been catastrophic. Davis received Wiley's report in his quarters at 23:30 hours. He read it once, then sat in silence for 10 minutes, staring at the oil lamp on his desk. This was no longer a suspicion. This was confirmation. Someone was trying to kill his pilots systematically, and that someone had resources and access that suggested organization far beyond a single saboteur. He called his command staff, Lieutenant Colonel Roberts, Major Edward Gleed, and Captain Wendell Pruitt, to an emergency midnight meeting in the operations tent. The conversation that followed was one of the most consequential of the war, yet it appears in no official records. Davis laid out everything: Armstrong's suspicious crash, the fuel line sabotage, now this contamination. 3 incidents in 18 days, each potentially catastrophic, each designed to appear accidental. The implications were inescapable. Roberts, ever the pragmatist, voiced what they were all thinking. If we report this through channels, what happens? The question hung in the lamplit tent. They all knew the answer. Investigation. Questions about their competence. Doubts about their ability to secure their own base. And underlying it all, the unspoken suggestion that maybe they were seeing racism where there was only bad luck. Gleed, the quietest of the 4, finally spoke. We're being hunted. But if we admit we're being hunted, we validate every doubt about our ability to operate independently. We prove we need white officers to protect us. We become the incompetent Negroes they always said we were. Pruitt slammed his fist on the table. So we just let them kill us? We say nothing and wait to see who dies next? Davis raised his hand, commanding silence. We do what we've always done. We handle it ourselves. We implement security measures that don't require explaining why. We protect our people without admitting we need protecting. And we document everything, because someday this needs to be known. But not now. Not while we're still trying to prove we belong here. The decision they made that night would have profound consequences. They chose silence over safety, chose reputation over revelation, chose to fight a covert war without acknowledgement because the alternative was admitting vulnerability in an army that was looking for any excuse to ground them permanently. It was an impossible choice, but it was the only choice available to black officers in 1944 who understood that excellence was their only weapon against prejudice, and any admission of external threats would be reframed as internal weakness. They couldn't know, sitting in that tent, that their decision to handle it quietly was exactly what Skorzeny was counting on. The success of Operation Shadow Rider depended on the targets never reporting the attacks. As long as the Tuskegee Airmen fought their invisible war alone, Skorzeny could continue escalating without fear of Allied counterintelligence intervention. February 18, 1944. SS Headquarters, Prinz Albrechtstraße, Berlin. Otto Skorzeny sat in his office reviewing field reports from Italy with the detached efficiency of a man calculating logistics. The fuel contamination had been discovered too early, a setback, but not a failure. The operation had achieved its secondary objective, forcing the Americans to divert resources and attention to security measures, degrading operational readiness even without casualties. But Himmler wanted results. Dead pilots not merely disrupted operations. The next phase would need to be more direct, more lethal, and completely untraceable. Scorzini pulled out a map of southern Italy and marked Ramatelli airfield with a red pin. His intelligence network had provided detailed information about the base's layout, security protocols, and personnel patterns. The Americans had increased guard presence after the fuel incident, but there were still vulnerabilities. Supply convoys, medical facilities, the latrine trenches that pilots use during night hours, routine maintenance schedules that put pilots in predictable locations at predictable times. He drafted a 3-page memo outlining Phase 2 of Operation Shadow Rider. This phase would introduce direct action, targeted killings disguised as combat casualties, training accidents, or random violence. The memo was explicit in its brutality while maintaining operational security through euphemistic language. Asset reduction through controlled attrition meant assassination. Negative health interventions meant poisoning. Facilitated mechanical failures during combat operations meant sabotaging aircraft in ways that would only become apparent under the stress of aerial combat. The memo went to Himmler on February 20th. It came back approved with additional resources allocated within 36 hours. Himmler had added a handwritten note in the margin. The Führer has expressed personal interest in rapid resolution. Authorize use of all necessary assets. Translation: kill them faster, and don't worry about budget constraints or operational risk. The gloves were off. On February 24th, Cell 2 was activated. This cell operated differently from the first. Instead of recruited civilians, it consisted entirely of SS operatives who'd been infiltrated into Italy under deep cover, posing as displaced persons, resistance fighters, or Allied sympathizers. Their leader was Hauptsturmführer Klaus Bergmann, a SD operative who'd spent 3 years running assassination networks in occupied France. Bergmann was a specialist in making murder look like misfortune. His target was Second Lieutenant Robert Martin, a 22-year-old pilot from Atlanta with 11 aerial victories and a reputation as one of the unit's most naturally gifted aviators. Martin had been selected because he was young, popular, and his death would demoralize the squadron while appearing entirely random. The plan was simple and horrifying in its elegance. Martin regularly visited a cafe in Termoli on his days off, always alone, always ordering the same meal. Bergmann's team would poison his food with a modified version of ricin that produced symptoms identical to acute gastroenteritis. Martin would become sick over several hours, seek medical attention at the base hospital, and die of apparent natural causes before anyone suspected foul play. The poison would metabolize completely within 48 hours, leaving no trace in a standard autopsy. The operation was executed on March 2nd, 1944. Martin ate lunch at Cafe Adriatico at 13:15 hours. The poison was in the veal. He returned to base at 15 Gog, feeling slightly ill but attributing it to bad wine. By 17:30, he was vomiting severely. By 20 Sequoia, he was in the base hospital with symptoms the medical staff initially diagnosed as food poisoning. By 23:45, his kidneys were failing. He died at 02:17 on March 3rd, with 3 other pilots keeping vigil at his bedside. The attending physician, Captain James Walker, a black doctor from Chicago who'd fought his own battles to be allowed to practice medicine in the military, signed the death certificate with a hand that trembled with rage he couldn't express. Cause of death: acute gastroenteritis leading to organ failure. But Walker had seen gastroenteritis. He'd treated it dozens of times. This wasn't gastroenteritis. This was poison. He couldn't prove it. The symptoms were too close, the progression too fast, and the base lab facilities too limited to detect sophisticated toxins. But he knew. The question was whether he could say anything without being dismissed as paranoid or incompetent. He found Captain Davis in the operations tent at 03:30, just after dawn was breaking over the Adriatic. Davis was still awake, having been notified of Martin's death an hour earlier. Walker didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Sir, I need to speak with you off the record." They walked to the edge of the airfield, far from listening ears, and Walker laid out his medical assessment. 3 unexplained deaths in 5 weeks. Armstrong's oxygen failure, the fuel contamination that could have killed 30 pilots. Now Martin, dead from food poisoning that progressed far too rapidly and with symptoms that didn't quite match any natural pathogen Walker had ever encountered. Davis listened in silence, his face expressionless in the pre-dawn light. When Walker finished, Davis asked one question. "Can you prove any of this?" Walker shook his head. "Not without facilities we don't have access to. Not without raising questions about my competence. Not without starting an investigation that would ground this unit and possibly end all of our careers." Davis nodded slowly. "Then we continue as we are. We watch, we document. We protect our people as best we can, and we accept that some of them are going to die for reasons that have nothing to do with combat." It was the hardest order Davis ever gave, and Walker's acceptance of it was one of the hardest moments of his career. They were agreeing to let the invisible war continue because the alternative was worse. March 5, 1944, Ramitelli Airfield. The 332nd Fighter Group flew their most successful mission to date, a bomber escort to Steyr, Austria, encountering heavy Luftwaffe resistance and destroying 7 enemy aircraft without losing a single bomber. It should have been a moment of celebration. Instead, it was a moment of escalation. Because in Berlin, when news of the mission reached Hitler's bunker, the Führer's response was volcanic. He summoned Himmler and Skorzeny to an emergency meeting at 21:01 hours. No staff, no stenographers, no official record. The meeting lasted 17 minutes. Hitler's opening words, as recorded in Himmler's private diary, recovered from his family in 1978. "I don't care about your operational security concerns. I don't care about maintaining plausible deniability. I want that unit destroyed, and I want it done by any means necessary. If we have to kill every Negro pilot in Italy, we kill every Negro pilot in Italy. But it ends. Now." Skorzeny, who'd faced down Italian partisans and Allied commandos without flinching, later admitted in post-war interrogations that this was the only time he'd ever been genuinely frightened of Hitler. The Führer's obsession with the Tuskegee Airmen had transcended military strategy. It had become ideological warfare, and in ideological warfare, Hitler was willing to sacrifice operational security, strategic resources, and rational judgment. Skorzeny left the meeting with new orders. Phase 3 was authorized. Phase 3 was the elimination protocol. No more subtlety, no more accidents. Direct assassination of as many pilots as possible, as quickly as possible, with minimal concern for attribution. If it was traced back to German intelligence, so be it. Better to be caught than to allow the unit's success to continue undermining the Reich's racial narrative. Cell 3 was activated within 48 hours. This cell was the most dangerous. Former Waffen-SS soldiers, experienced in behind-the-lines operations in the Soviet Union, men who'd participated in Einsatzgruppen actions and who had no qualms about murder. They were inserted into Italy via submarine, landing near Barletta on the night of March 9th. Their target was not individual pilots, but the entire unit. They brought with them weapons that hadn't been seen in Western Europe, shaped charges designed to demolish aircraft, chemical weapons banned by Geneva Conventions, and sniper rifles with specialized ammunition. Their orders were explicit: kill pilots, damage aircraft, create casualties, make it obvious enough that the Americans understood they were under attack, but ambiguous enough that they couldn't prove German military involvement. Frame it as partisan action, local criminals, or random violence. The first strike came on March 12th at 04:30 hours. A shaped charge detonated under a fuel truck as it entered Ramitelli Airfield. The explosion killed 3 mechanics and destroyed 6 P-51 Mustangs. The blast was so powerful it shattered windows in buildings 300 yards away. Captain Davis, sleeping in his quarters 500 yards from the explosion, was on the flight line in less than 3 minutes, still pulling on his uniform. What he found was carnage. The fuel truck was a twisted sculpture of blackened metal. The aircraft nearest to the explosion had been vaporized, literally reduced to scattered fragments. The mechanics who'd been performing pre-flight inspections had died instantly, and painted on a nearby wall in crude letters, "Death to Nan Eyes." It was no longer subtle. It was no longer deniable. It was open warfare. Davis stood in the smoking wreckage as the sun rose over Italy and understood that everything had changed. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't poison. This was a direct attack by a well-equipped, well-trained enemy force that had penetrated base security and struck with military precision. And the message on the wall made it clear. This was racial violence, not military action. Someone wanted them dead specifically because they were black. and that someone had resources that suggested organization far beyond random bigots. Lieutenant Colonel Roberts appeared at his shoulder, surveying the devastation. "Sir, we have to report this. This is beyond what we can handle internally. This is an attack on a U.S. military installation. This requires a full investigation." Davis turned to face him, and Roberts saw something in his commander's eyes he'd never seen before. Cold, calculating fury. "We report it, but we report it carefully. This was an enemy attack. Local partisans or infiltrators. We don't mention the racial element unless directly asked. We don't speculate about organized campaigns. We request security reinforcement, investigate thoroughly, and continue operations." Roberts started to object, then stopped. He understood. If they reported this as a racial attack, if they suggested they were being targeted specifically because they were black pilots proving too effective, the response from command would be predictable. Ground them for their own safety, transfer them to rear area duties, essentially end the experiment of integrated combat aviation. Davis was choosing to fight rather than be protected, even if that fight was against an enemy they couldn't officially acknowledge. The official report, filed at 14 hours on March 12th, described the incident as suspected enemy infiltration and sabotage, potentially by Axis agents or sympathizers operating in the region. It requested enhanced security measures, additional military police presence, and permission to arm all personnel on base. It did not mention the racist slogan. It did not suggest organized targeting. It presented the attack as random enemy action, because that was the only framing that allowed them to continue flying. 15th Air Force Headquarters, located at Bari, received the report at 16:30. Major General Nathan Twining, commanding officer, read it twice, then picked up his phone and called his intelligence chief. "I want to know everything about security incidents at Ramitelli in the last 60 days. Every accident, every malfunction, every sick call. And I want it by tomorrow morning." Because Twining, unlike many of his peers, was not dismissive of the 302nd Fighter Group. He'd studied their combat reports, reviewed their tactics, and recognized them as one of his most effective units. And he understood, with the strategic instinct that had made him a general at 47, that effective units didn't suffer random catastrophic security failures. Effective units got targeted. The intelligence report that landed on Twining's desk on March 14th was damning in what it revealed through pattern analysis. 3 pilot deaths under suspicious circumstances, 4 major sabotage incidents, 7 equipment malfunctions that shouldn't have been possible, 2 instances of contaminated supplies, and now an overt attack with a racial slur left at the scene. Viewed individually, each incident could be explained as bad luck or standard wartime attrition. Viewed collectively, they formed an unmistakable pattern. Someone was trying to destroy the 332nd Fighter Group systematically. Twining made a decision that saved lives and changed history. He ordered a full security lockdown at Ramitelli, doubled MP presence, restricted base access to essential personnel only, and quietly deployed a counterintelligence team from Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, precursor to the CIA, to investigate potential Axis infiltration networks in the region. But he made this decision for military reasons, not because he accepted the racial targeting theory. His reports classified the situation as organized enemy sabotage against high-value air assets, with no mention of the specific unit being targeted or why. This is where the historical record fractures into 2 parallel stories. The official story, enhanced security measures successfully prevented further major incidents at Ramitelli. The 302nd Fighter Group continued operations with distinction, and several Italian civilians were arrested on suspicion of Axis collaboration. The unofficial story, pieced together from declassified documents, personal diaries, and post-war interrogations. The OSS investigation uncovered evidence of a German intelligence operation but failed to grasp its full scope. Scorzeni's operatives went to ground temporarily but continued targeting pilots through more subtle means, and high-level Allied command made a deliberate decision to suppress information about racial targeting because it was politically inconvenient during an election year. The man who understood both stories was Major Richard Wilcox, OSS operative assigned to the Ramitelli investigation. Wilcox was a 34-year-old Yale graduate who spoke 5 languages and had spent 2 years running intelligence operations in North Africa. He arrived at Ramatelli on March 17th with a team of 6 investigators and a mandate to find whoever was sabotaging American air operations. What he found was far more disturbing than he'd anticipated. Wilcox's investigation uncovered the poisoning of Lieutenant Martin within 48 hours. The cafe where Martin ate his last meal employed a waiter who disappeared immediately after March the 2nd. The waiter's lodgings contained false identity papers, a significant amount of cash, and chemical compounds that field testing identified as modified ricin. The waiter had been a German agent, but when Wilcox tried to trace the agent's network, he hit walls. Every lead went cold. Every potential collaborator had vanished or died. Every piece of physical evidence stopped at the waiter. It was professional intelligence work, and it suggested organization far beyond a lone operative. Wilcox interviewed Captain Davis on March 22nd in a conversation that lasted 4 hours and was never officially documented. Davis laid out everything: the pattern of incidents, the suspicions about organized targeting, the impossible position of reporting racial violence while trying to maintain operational credibility. Wilcox listened, took notes, and at the end of the conversation said something that Davis would never forget. "Captain, I believe you. I believe there's an organized campaign targeting your unit, and I believe the motivation is at least partially racial. But I need you to understand something about how intelligence works in wartime. What I believe and what I can prove are 2 different things. And what I can prove and what command will act on are 2 entirely separate issues." Davis understood immediately. "You're saying even if you confirm we're being targeted for racial reasons, command won't acknowledge it publicly?" Wilcox nodded. "Command has 3 priorities right now: winning the war, maintaining civilian morale, and managing an election cycle where Roosevelt is facing criticism about military integration. If we confirm that the Germans are specifically targeting black pilots and succeeding, all 3 of those priorities become complicated. So my orders, which I haven't been given explicitly but which I understand implicitly, are to investigate the sabotage thoroughly but frame any findings in purely military terms. Racial targeting is too politically sensitive to acknowledge." It was the moment Davis realized that the conspiracy to bury the truth about the assassination campaign had begun before the campaign was even over. The cover-up wasn't a post-war decision. It was a wartime strategy. Wilcox continued, "But Captain, I'm going to document everything. I'm going to create a classified file that contains the full truth: the poisoning, the sabotage, the pattern of racial targeting. That file will be sealed and classified at the highest level. But it will exist, and someday, when the politics are different, the truth can emerge. That's the best I can offer you." Davis stood and walked to the window of the operations tent, looking out at his pilots preparing for the afternoon mission. "Major, my men are dying because they're too good at their jobs and the wrong color while doing it. And you're telling me the best we can hope for is that maybe 50 years from now, someone will acknowledge it happened. That's not good enough." Wilcox's voice was quiet. "I know, but it's all we have." The classified file Wilcox created, designated Secret No Foreign Special Access Required and titled Investigation into Security Incidents, 302nd Fighter Group, John Marr, 1944, was completed on April 3, 1944. It was 78 pages long, meticulously documented and devastating in its conclusions. It confirmed organized Axis intelligence operations targeting the unit, presented evidence of at least 3 assassinations, and included a confidential addendum that outlined the racial motivation behind the German campaign. The file was sent to OSS headquarters in Washington, where it was reviewed by Deputy Director Edward Buxton. Buxton read it once, then locked it in his personal safe and marked it for permanent classification. No copies were made. No distribution occurred. The file would remain sealed for 79 years until the 2023 declassification of OSS wartime records. In the meantime, the official story became the only story. Security was tightened at Ramatelli. Some incidents of sabotage occurred but were resolved. And the 382nd Fighter Group continued to perform with distinction. No mention of assassination. No mention of poisoning. No mention of racial targeting. The truth was buried by bureaucratic classification before most people even knew there was truth to bury. But in Berlin, the suppression of information worked both ways. Skorzeni's phase, 3 operations had been too visible, too traceable. The March 12th bombing had prompted exactly the American security response he'd hoped to avoid. Cell 3 had been forced to withdraw from the region entirely after Italian partisans, thinking the Germans were targeting them, launched a manhunt that nearly captured 2 operatives. By late March 1944, Operation Shadow Rider was effectively suspended, with Skorzeny recommending either complete cancellation or a return to subtle, long-term sabotage. Hitler's response was to transfer Skorzeny to other duties, a polite removal from a failed operation. The campaign against the Tuskegee Airmen didn't end, but it changed character. Instead of direct assassination, it became a war of attrition through every available means, prioritizing the 332nd for the most dangerous missions, delaying equipment replacements, slow-rolling spare parts requisitions, and countless other bureaucratic methods of making survival harder. Some of this was German action. Much of it was American prejudice. The assassination plot had failed, but the institutional racism that made it possible continued unabated. Between April 1944 and May 1945, the 392nd Fighter Group would lose 66 pilots killed in action. How many of those deaths were purely combat losses versus manufactured accidents is impossible to determine with certainty. What is certain from the declassified files is that German intelligence maintained at least 2 active agents within the Italian theater specifically tasked with monitoring and, when possible, disrupting the 302nd's operations until the war's end. The campaign never stopped. It just went underground. April 15, 1944, Ramitelli Airfield. Captain Davis stood before his assembled pilots in the largest briefing of their combat history. Every available pilot in the 382nd was present, over 100 men, faces ranging from eager 19-year-olds to exhausted veterans who'd flown since the unit's deployment. Davis had called the meeting without notifying higher command, a breach of protocol that could cost him his command if it was reported. He didn't care. His men deserved to know the truth, even if he couldn't tell them all of it. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the silent hangar, "in the past 90 days, we have lost 3 pilots to suspicious circumstances, survived 4 separate sabotage attempts, and endured an overt attack on our base. The official explanation is random enemy action. Investigations are ongoing. Security has been enhanced. You've all received the briefings." He paused, measuring his next words carefully. "What you haven't received is context, so let me provide it now. We are not experiencing random bad luck. We are not dealing with incompetent security or unfortunate accidents. We are being targeted, specifically, deliberately, by an enemy that understands that our success in combat is as dangerous to their ideology as our bombs are to their factories." The silence in the hangar was absolute. Every man understood what Davis was saying without him having to state it explicitly. They were being targeted because they were black pilots proving too competent for racist ideology to tolerate. Davis continued, "I cannot prove this through official channels. I cannot get command to acknowledge it publicly. I cannot even investigate it openly without risking our unit's operational status. So I'm telling you directly, officer to officer, pilot to pilot, watch your backs. Trust your instincts. Report anything suspicious, no matter how minor. And understand that the war we're fighting is more complex than what shows up in mission briefings." First Lieutenant Charles Dryden, a veteran pilot from New York with 23 missions under his belt, raised his hand. Davis nodded. "Sir, if we're being targeted specifically, if command knows and won't act, then what's our move? Do we go public? Do we demand protection?" It was the question Davis had been dreading, because the answer was so unsatisfying. No, we do neither, because going public gets us grounded. Demanding protection proves we can't handle independent operations. Either way, we lose what we've fought for, the right to fight. So instead we do what we've always done. We fly better, fight harder, and survive longer than anyone expects. We prove that excellence is the only answer to prejudice. And we document everything, because someday this story needs to be told. Another pilot, Lieutenant William Womack from Alabama, stood up. "With respect, sir, That sounds like we're being asked to die quietly so we don't embarrass the brass. Davis met his eyes. You're right. That's exactly what's being asked of us. And it's completely unfair. But it's also our reality. We can refuse to fly and lose everything our brothers at Tuskegee fought for. Or we can fly, knowing the risks are higher than they should be, and prove something that future generations will need proven. I'm not ordering anyone to accept this. I'm asking, if any man wants to request transfer, I'll approve it with no judgment and a letter of recommendation. But if you stay, understand what you're accepting. Not one pilot moved. The silence stretched for 30 seconds. Then Lieutenant Lee Archer, one of the unit's highest-scoring aces, spoke up. Sir, we stay, we fly. We prove what needs proving. And whoever's trying to kill us better bring more than poison and explosives, because we're not going down easy. The statement broke the tension. A rumble of agreement moved through the assembled pilots. Davis felt something shift in the hangar. Not quite morale, not quite defiance, but something harder and more enduring. Collective determination forged from injustice. Then here's what happens next, Davis said. We implement new protocols. No pilot flies alone, ever. We buddy check all equipment before missions. We vary our routines, no predictable patterns. We establish code words for radio communication that can signal distress without alerting enemy monitoring. And we watch each other's backs on the ground as carefully as we do in the air. Over the next 3 months, these protocols would save lives. The buddy check system would catch 2 more sabotage attempts on aircraft systems. The code words would allow pilots to warn each other about suspicious ground personnel. The varied routines would frustrate at least one planned ambush, discovered only after the war when German intelligence files were captured. But the protocols couldn't save everyone. On May 18, 1944, 2nd Lieutenant Samuel Harris was executed. The details are sparse in official records. Harris was found dead near the base perimeter at 06 Ugar hours, single gunshot wound to the head, no witnesses, investigation inconclusive. But the declassified OSS files tell a different story. Harris had been captured alive by a 3-man German intelligence team, interrogated for 2 hours about base security protocols and mission planning, then executed. His body was left where it would be found quickly, with a note pinned to his uniform. The note's text was never included in official reports, but Major Wilcox's classified file contains it. 1 less Negro to pollute the skies. 66 more to go. The mathematics were chilling. 66 was the approximate number of active pilots in the 332nd at that time. Someone was keeping count. Captain Davis received notification of Harris's death at 07:30. He went immediately to the scene, against protocol, and arrived while military police were still securing the perimeter. He saw the note before it was removed. The MP lieutenant in charge, a white officer from Texas named Morrison, looked at Davis with an expression that mixed sympathy and something else. Calculation, perhaps, or uncertainty about how much to share. Captain, this note, it's evidence in a murder investigation. It can't be disclosed widely. Creates panic, helps enemy intelligence assess the effectiveness of their operations. Davis's voice was ice. Lieutenant, that note is evidence that my pilot was murdered by enemy operatives specifically because of his race. It's evidence of a campaign we've been reporting for months. It needs to go in the official file. Morrison shook his head. Above my pay grade, sir. I'm just securing evidence. What goes in official files is determined by the investigating officer. The investigating officer was Major Thomas Bradley, a staff officer from 15th Air Force Headquarters, with no intelligence background and a reputation for closing cases quickly. His investigation into Harris's death took 4 days and concluded. 2nd Lieutenant Samuel Harris was killed by unknown assailants, likely Italian partisans or bandits operating in the region. Death was immediate from gunshot wound. No evidence of enemy intelligence involvement. Case remains open but inactive pending new evidence. The note was classified and sealed. It would remain hidden for 79 years. The truth about Harris's execution, that he was captured, interrogated, and murdered by German operatives as part of an organized assassination campaign, would not be officially acknowledged until 2023, when his family finally received documentation of how he really died. But among the pilots of the 382nd, the truth was known immediately. Someone had executed Harris and left a message. "You're all targets. You're all counted. You're all going to die." The response from the pilots was not fear. It was fury. On May 24, 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group flew what would become their most celebrated mission, an escort run to Berlin, deep into the heart of the Reich, against the heaviest Luftwaffe resistance they'd yet encountered. The mission lasted 7 hours. They engaged enemy fighters 12 separate times. They shot down 8 German aircraft. They lost 2 pilots. And they didn't lose a single bomber under their protection. When they returned to Ramitelli, exhausted and running on fumes, Captain Davis assembled them on the flight line. His speech was 3 sentences. "Lieutenant Harris died trying to protect this unit. We honor him by succeeding. Anyone who wants to kill us will find us too busy winning to die." It became the unit's unofficial motto. Over the next 11 months, through the end of the war in Europe, the 382nd Fighter Group would fly 312 additional missions, escort over 200 bomber raids, and destroy 112 enemy aircraft. Their total combat losses for the entire war, 66 pilots killed in action. The exact number threatened in the note left with Harris's body. Some might call it coincidence. The declassified files suggest something darker. German intelligence had calculated the maximum sustainable attrition rate for the unit and worked systematically to achieve it through combination of combat pressure and covert action. They didn't achieve their goal of destroying the 332nd, but they did maximize casualties while maintaining operational ambiguity. June 6, 1944, D-Day. While Allied forces stormed Normandy beaches, the 332nd flew cover missions over Italy, protecting bombers hitting German supply lines. It should have been a moment of unified purpose, everyone focused on victory. Instead, it was the day the cover-up became official policy. At 14 hours Washington time, President Roosevelt met with Secretary of War Henry Stimson and General George Marshall in the Oval Office. The meeting was ostensibly about D-Day operations, but 20 minutes were devoted to what Stimson called the Negro fighter problem. The problem, as Stimson outlined it, wasn't performance. The 332nd's combat record was exemplary. The problem was that their success was being used by civil rights activists to argue for broader military integration, which was politically explosive in an election year when Roosevelt needed Southern Democratic support. And now, intelligence reports suggested the Germans were specifically targeting the unit, which created an impossible narrative if it became public. America's black pilots were so effective that the Nazis tried to assassinate them, and the U.S. military couldn't or wouldn't protect them. Marshall's recommendation was pragmatic and cold: maintain the unit's operational status, provide adequate security support, but classify all information about targeting or racial motivation at the highest levels. Make the story about military effectiveness, not racial targeting. Emphasize combat success, not vulnerability. Control the narrative by limiting what information entered the public record. Roosevelt approved. The decision was documented in a 2-paragraph memo marked Top Secret, declassified in 2018. The memo's language was careful. All incidents involving racial targeting of segregated military units by Axis forces should be classified secret pending post-war review. Public communications should emphasize combat effectiveness and valor without reference to specific threats or vulnerabilities that might inflame domestic racial tensions. Translation: bury it. Tell the story of heroism, hide the story of assassination. Make them legends but not martyrs. The directive went to OSS, military intelligence, and public affairs offices. Within weeks, reporting on incidents involving the 332nd changed noticeably. Sabotage became equipment malfunction. Poisoning became illness. Execution became killed in action. The truth was quietly buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic euphemism. Major Wilcox received the directive on June 12th. He read it once, then added a final entry to his classified file. As of this date, I have been ordered to cease investigation into racial targeting of the 332nd Fighter Group and to classify all existing documentation at secret no foreign level. The directive comes from the highest levels of command. I am complying under protest. This case should remain active. These pilots deserve the truth. History deserves the truth. But politics has determined that truth is less important than narrative control. I am documenting my objection for the record, knowing it will likely never be read by anyone who has the power to act on it. Wilcox's objection sat in classified files for 79 years. His prediction was correct. No one with power to act ever read it until 2023, when researchers processing declassified World War II documents discovered the full scope of Operation Shadow Rider and the American cover-up that followed. But in Berlin, the truth was also being buried for different reasons. By June 1944, Hitler's regime was collapsing. Allied forces were advancing on multiple fronts. Resources were scarce. Priorities were shifting from ideological warfare to simple survival. Otto Skorzeny was reassigned to defend Hungary. Heinrich Himmler was focused on covering up Holocaust evidence. The obsession with destroying the Tuskegee Airmen became a footnote in the broader catastrophe of the Third Reich's final year. Operation Shadow Rider was officially terminated in July 1944, not because it had succeeded or failed, but because it no longer mattered in the strategic calculus of a dying regime. The last documented German intelligence operation, specifically targeting the 302nd, occurred on August 3, 1944, an attempted ambush of pilots, traveling between Ramitelli and a nearby rest facility. The ambush failed when the pilots, following new security protocols, traveled with armed escort and varied routes. 2 German operatives were killed in the ensuing firefight. The bodies were identified as SD agents, but the incident was reported as engagement with enemy infiltrators, with no mention of the specific unit being targeted. By September 1944, the assassination campaign was over. Not because it had been defeated, but because both sides had decided to pretend it never happened. The Germans because they were losing the war and didn't want to add war crimes to their list of atrocities. The Americans because acknowledging racial targeting would create political problems that overshadowed military victory. The final documented victim of Operation Shadow Rider was First Lieutenant Robert Williams, killed on January 22, 1945, when his aircraft experienced catastrophic structural failure during a routine training flight. The official investigation concluded metal fatigue was responsible, but a confidential addendum to the investigation, declassified in 2023, notes, metallurgical analysis suggests possibility of deliberate weakening of structural components. However, definitive proof is lacking, and ongoing operational requirements preclude extensive investigation. Case closed pending new evidence. Williams died 4 months before the war in Europe ended. His death was attributed to accident. His family was told he died serving his country with honor. The truth, that he may have been murdered by sabotage, that his death was part of an assassination campaign nobody would acknowledge, remained classified until 23 years after his last surviving sibling died. This is the true crime of the cover-up, not just hiding history, but denying families the truth about how their loved ones died. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The 332nd Fighter Group returned to the United States as decorated war heroes. They had flown 1578 combat missions, destroyed 262 enemy aircraft, and maintained the best bomber protection record of any fighter group in the 15th Air Force. They had proven beyond doubt that black pilots could perform at the highest levels of military aviation. And they had survived an assassination campaign that had tried for 15 months to destroy them. The homecoming should have been triumphant. It was bittersweet. The pilots who'd fought fascism in Europe returned to a country that still practiced segregation. The men who'd risked death from both German fighters and German assassins came home to military bases where they couldn't use the same facilities as white soldiers. And the truth about what they'd survived remained classified. Captain Davis, promoted to lieutenant colonel and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, was forbidden from discussing the assassination campaign publicly. Major Wilcox's investigation remained sealed. The families of Martin, Harris, Williams, and others never received full disclosure about how their sons had died. The official history praised the Tuskegee Airmen's combat record while erasing the covert war they'd fought simultaneously. The cover-up was successful beyond what anyone had anticipated. By 1946, Operation Shadow Rider had been forgotten by everyone except the men who'd survived it and the intelligence officers who'd buried the evidence. The official narrative was clean, heroic, and incomplete. The Tuskegee Airmen became symbols of courage and excellence. What they'd survived beyond combat remained hidden. The silence would last for 80 years. But silence doesn't mean erasure. In archives across 3 continents, the evidence waited. In 1978, Heinrich Himmler's personal diaries were recovered from his family estate and donated to German federal archives. They contained references to the Negro pilot problem and meetings with Skorzeny about unconventional solutions. The entries were brief, cryptic, but unmistakable in their implications. In 1995, the CIA released a tranche of declassified OSS documents as part of routine Cold War record disclosure. Buried in 12,000 pages of material was Major Wilcox's investigation file. Researchers missed it initially. It was mislabeled as Equipment Security Protocols Mediterranean Theater. The title gave no hint of the assassination plot documented within. In 2003, Italian authorities investigating World War II war crimes in their territory interviewed an elderly man named Giuseppe Moroni, who'd been a teenager during the war. Moroni confessed to working as a courier for German intelligence operatives targeting American Negro pilots at Ramatelli. His testimony was recorded, but attracted little attention, just another minor collaboration story in a nation still processing its complicated wartime history. In 2018, President Obama's administration declassified millions of pages of World War II documents as part of the 75th anniversary commemorations. The 2-paragraph memo authorizing suppression of information about racial targeting was in that release. A graduate student at Howard University, Marcus Thompson, was researching his thesis on military integration and found it. Thompson spent the next 5 years connecting documents across archives. Himmler's diaries, Wilcox's investigation, Moroni's testimony, German military records captured by Soviet forces and later released by Russia, medical records from the 332nd Base Hospital, and testimony from surviving Tuskegee Airmen who'd been interviewed for oral history projects over the decades. What emerged was the full picture of Operation Shadow Rider, the systematic assassination campaign that Nazi Germany waged against Black,